Chapter 28, The Age of Anxiety. This chapter is going to feature primarily cultural and intellectual trends set between the two world wars, so 1918 to 1939. It's a great chapter that starts off with modern philosophy, then we'll get into art, music, film, and it'll conclude with a discussion of some of the political and economic situations that resulted from World War I, all of which points us toward the Second World War. So the chapter begins with a section called Uncertainty in Modern Thought. This is philosophy, the beginning of modern philosophy. And really, World War I was a catalyst event, I would say, for a new philosophical era. Basically, before 1914, we still were continuing with the philosophies of the Enlightenment, the idea of progress, optimism, and rationality, that through scientific principles and intellectual progress, the world could be made a better place, and that we were getting better as a society. World War I shattered those beliefs, and it really put a stop for most people at the time to a belief in the Enlightenment, that reason and rationality would always win. The war was so destructive and so just the disaster of it all, and the number of deaths and all of it just really shattered the people's belief in progress and order, and they were left with a sense of disorientation and confusion and pessimism. So that's after 19. The modern philosophy rejects the Enlightenment, that we can know all things and figure things out and use science to better mankind. Because in World War I, science was used to create new weapons of death and just kill people more effectively. And so science was not going to be the answer for this generation of philosophers. Paul Valery is one of the first to kind of put this out there as a philosophy. There's a great quote that we'll start with here at the beginning of the chapter. It's a really, sort of disturbing passage. The storm has died away, and we are still restless, uneasy, as if the storm were about to break. Almost all the affairs of men remain a terrible uncertainty. We think of what has disappeared, and we are almost destroyed by what has been destroyed. We do not know what will be born, and we fear the future, not without reason. Doubt and disorder are in us and with us. There is no thinking man, however shrewd or learned he may be, who can hope to dominate this anxiety, to escape from this impression of darkness. He wrote that in the early 1920s, and it really sets the tone for modern philosophy, which is sort of based on the cruelly injured mind. The war itself damaged people's psychology, and the philosophy is an outcropping of that. So it's a crisis of thought. This is why it's called the Age of Anxiety. Friedrich Nietzsche had come before World War I, but he was almost a predictor or a harbinger, a prophet of things to come. A German philosopher, very famous for saying the phrase, God is dead. And it's very much more complicated than that literal sentence, but that's his sort of one-liner that you should know. He rejected Christianity and traditional moral values. He believed that the West, European and American society was in decline. He believed that there would be a race of people that would rise up that he called Overmensch would be the German word. Superior individuals would rise up to overcome these troubles. In the widely misunderstood philosopher, very difficult to understand. In the future, German radicals like the Nazis would actually take Nietzsche's ideas and say that he was speaking of them in the future. Very hard to understand guy. In fact, all of modern philosophy is very complex, very difficult to understand, to teach it. Friedrich Nietzsche himself went insane. He lost his mind. He had mental illness, and he was confined to an asylum for his later years. And other philosophers would come to his insane asylum, mental hospital really, and they would watch him and they would study him. And he lived for a long time after having become insane. And so he became kind of a science experiment in and of himself, and other people would come and study him as he was now beyond, his rationalism. And anyway, a very interesting story. I'll tell you more about Nietzsche in class. Henry Bergson, French philosopher believed that immediate experience and intuition was all we had. What was happening right now, right in front of us, is all that matters. George Sorel, another French philosopher, a Marxist philosopher, kind of like Nietzsche, believed that a small intellectual elite would dominate the future of the world. Now, these are complicated thoughts and ideas. On to page 2. Logical empiricism was a movement of philosophy led by Ludwig Wittgenstein. And the major ideas of this as well was that it rejected traditional moral philosophies, traditional subjects of philosophy like morality, God, the nature of good and evil. He said all of those things are a waste of time. We can't prove any of them, we can't disprove any of them, so we need to just stop that altogether. Existentialism is an important term that you should know from the early 20th century. As a school of philosophy, primarily existentialists were people who were despairing. There's a sense of life's absurdity. They were almost always atheists. Jean-Paul Sartre is a famous existentialist. He wrote several important books and plays. One that I read in school was a play called No Exit, where the characters are all trapped in hell and they can't seem to find their way out. So it's a very dark sort of stuff. They did say that life's absurdity could be overcome by strong-minded individuals. Again, that's kind of the common theme here, that mental strength can overcome life's meaninglessness. Existentialism is popular in Germany in the 1920s and France after the Second World War. Anything else we need to know about existentialists here? Yeah, they didn't believe in God, reason, or progress, despair, and the meaninglessness of life. Individuals must choose their own actions courageously and consistently, in full awareness of their inescapable responsibility for their own behavior. There's another quote that you could think about. Another thing from Sartre: man is condemned to be free. Chew on that one for a little while. Yeah, modern philosophy. It's not my forte per se, but something we ought to know. Section C is something we can probably get our heads around a little bit more clearly. There was actually, at the same time as the new existentialists and logical empiricists who rejected Christianity and traditional moral values, at the same time, there was a rebirth of Christianity, almost like a second Reformation in some ways. Before 1914, there was really kind of the peak of atheism and the outcomes of the Enlightenment, which were so secular, and they had really taken away, as people were ministers themselves, Christians themselves, were de-emphasizing the spiritual nature of the religion and of miracles of Christ and healing and any of those kind of things from the Bible that were supernatural. And they said that Christ was just a good teacher, a good moral philosopher like them. But after 1918, because of many ways the tragedy and the unbelievable, almost supernatural aspects of World War I in terms of the destruction of it, there was a revitalization of Christianity, and we call these guys the Christian existentialists, and there's several of their names mentioned here. Kierkegaard is Danish, Barth is Swiss, Gabriel Marcel was French, and they basically said that the only thing we can look to now to explain life is religion. It provides the answers to a broken world, and the world we live in is broken, and the war has broken it. T.S. Eliot wrote is a famous convert. A lot of these poets and authors became converted to Christianity, and that became a major theme of their work as they tried to explain the meaninglessness of life. It could only have meaning if there is a God and if there is religion. Aldous Huxley wrote A Brave New World. And then maybe most famously C.S. Lewis, who I hope you recall from maybe childhood as you read the Chronicles of Narnia, or maybe you've seen the movies. Those books were meant for young people, and there's an incredible Christian theme to those as you think about those, the Aslan, the lion, and being resurrected, after he was killed. So there's a lot of these Christian themes come into literature in the post-World War I period, at the same time as so much of the maybe the darker philosophy that denied the existence of God. Turn over to page 3. Bit of a new subject here. So, in addition to modern philosophy, science sort of takes a step forward. It's almost like phase 3 of the scientific revolution. Phase 1 being back in the 1700s with Galileo and Newton. Phase 2 being something we looked at in chapter 24, I believe, with the birth of modern thermodynamics and practical science, electricity, all of that. And then this is the 1920s, so it's almost phase 3. And it sort of is consistent with the philosophy. Old philosophy and old physics were based on the belief that everything could be controlled and figured out and experimented with, basically the scientific method. New physics is the work of Marie Curie and Max Planck, who studied the atomic structure, matter, and energy, as well as most famously Albert Einstein with his theory of relativity, which again says that all things are relative to those around them. It's basically saying that nothing can be known for sure. There's an infinite universe. Matter and energy are interchangeable at a certain point. And there's no more, the things that we used to know for sure, we no longer know for sure. At the same time, you have Ernst Rutherford splitting the atom, which was the smallest particle known to scientists at the time. He studied the structure of neutrons, and when you can split into infinitely small pieces the smallest known particle, it kind of shatters the belief that we can actually figure everything out. Once you can split the atom, this of course leads down the road to nuclear energy and atomic bombs, which are all based on that very same principle. So that's starting to move in a bit of a scary direction. Again, the implications here, everything is relative. Nothing is for sure, according to new physics and the new science. Uncertainty becomes the dominant word you should know with science. The Heisenberg principle is a scientific principle that characterizes uncertainty as just a fact in scientific experiments. You should look some of these things up, I think, and read the articles about them. They'll try to get into this a little bit more than this overview. And perhaps there's no answers from science as we used to, from the scientific revolution through the Enlightenment, science was seen as always being able to provide an answer. And now, according to Einstein and these folks, maybe there's just tendencies and probabilities instead of facts and certainties. Freudian psychology, we've already studied this once before, so here they mention it again as being a reflection of modernism in psychology. Before Freud, remember, it's the Enlightenment, the belief that people were rational, that people could be figured out consciously, predictably. And Freud, of course, really introduces a new idea, a new paradigm about philosophy, that human behavior is not rational. It's basically irrational and motivated by unconscious needs. And he really identified these three forces in the human soul or mind, or however you want to put it. The id, the ego, and the superego. The id it's really what you want to do. Your pleasure-seeking senses, really what you would want. Your ego is what you can do. Your own self-concept, what you can do. And of course, you've heard people say that person has a big ego. They believe highly of themselves. And the superego is the moral component to our psychology, what we should do. And that every decision that you make in life is a product of the interplay of these three forces. And it's all going on in your subconscious. You really aren't aware of it. But if you stop and think about it long enough, it's true. Everything that you decide in life is somewhat related to this. What you want to do, you balance these forces out. Here's what I want to do. Then is it even possible? And then there's this moral thing. What should I do? Right and wrong get mixed up in there a lot. So Freudian psychology points to these three underlying forces in our own minds that motivate all of our behavior, but most of the time we're not even aware of it. There's a lot more to say about Freud. I'll leave that for you to read in the textbook and to look up online. Some of it gets a little dicey at times, so we'll just move right along. Page 4, and we'll stop it right above section 2. The literature of the 20th century features a lot of the same components as the science and the philosophy, which is pessimism, confusion, a sense of relativism. Nothing is absolute, everything is just relative, a sense of alienation on the part of the speakers and authors of these books. Confused viewpoints in modern literature, mid 20th century literature. Sometimes you don't know who's speaking. The point of view will shift suddenly, and you won't know who's actually talking or narrating. One of the most unique features of this time in literature is what's called stream of consciousness, which is where an author attempts to capture the unconscious thoughts of a character, memories, dreams, fantasies, otherworldly experiences. And stream of consciousness literature is how you know you're reading it is that oftentimes there won't be any punctuation anymore. There won't be capital letters anymore. Sentence structure isn't followed. It's literally a string of words put together that really doesn't make any sense. And this might go on for pages after pages of this. And it's an author's attempt to capture what's going on in somebody's head. Woolf, Faulkner, Joyce, these are names of famous authors of the early 20th century. James Joyce wrote a book, Ulysses, where stream of consciousness is actually predominantly used in that. William Faulkner he's an American, he wrote a famous book called The Sound and the Fury. I had to read that in high school as well, where the whole thing is told through the eyes of a child with some mental illness going on at times. So these are books that are very interesting to read, hard to understand, but a lot of people like them because you can interpret them many ways. Another theme of literature is the rejection of progress. You have people writing what are called anti-utopias. So remember what a utopia was, of course, going back to even Thomas More. Ideal worlds and civilizations, and you think of Robert Owen with his New Harmony factory idea, but now you have authors in the post-World War I era saying that we can never live in a perfect world. And they write books that are called things like The Decline of the West, and that's by Spengler. And T.S. Eliot, the poet, writes a poem called The Wasteland, which is all about how we're sort of moving in the wrong direction. On the last little bit here, you have political pieces being written that express really a lot of fear and concern for the future, especially related to the rise of communism during the Russian Revolution and the dictatorship of Lenin and then eventually Stalin. You have George Orwell's 1984 and the famous Big Brother is watching us. That's a direct reference to a future society in which we really don't have freedom and choices anymore, and the government controls all of our society, our words, our speech is rewritten. Great book. I think some of you have probably read it or at least heard of it before. And that's where we'll stop for today, actually. 20th century philosophy, science, and literature, and we'll pick it up next time with art and music.